You're listening to the Valley Current.
Follow the rules. I go to the dean and say, hey, we have a problem. And we need to send letters to these kids and give them an official warning. And if they do it again, they're out. They get expelled.
Right.
But, and this for-profit educational institution, that's not the way things are done. And so instead of following the policy and the rule book, I get notice that, hey, I'm being replaced as instructor with someone
that's
more
so wrong.
Sensitive to student desires.
That's so wrong. I mean, that's so crazy. And you're pointing out in your kind of body language that it's like the profit motivation is running through all this in such an extreme way. And you could argue that becomes sort of the debilitation of the professions, plural, across all the professions, because, of course, we've even seen this in the medical profession where people believe that some doctors overbill or engage in all sorts of elective activities that aren't really absolutely necessary, but they're billable to insurance. And this is true for medical doctors, or at least arguably true for medical doctors, or some of them, dentists, or some of them. And it's like the profit motivation and the ability to submit an invoice generates this excessive activity designed to make sure those invoices continue to flow. So, I mean, the whole idea of a profession is that it's not about profit. It's about service. And it's about helping people in areas that they usually just can't understand, or that they would take too much time to really be able to understand. So they have to rely on professional advice, just like sometimes getting your car fixed, right? I mean, you have to rely on the professional advice that your licensed mechanic gives you, and hopefully he or she is telling you the truth. In Tesla's case, by the way, you don't talk to anyone. Just go back to Tesla for a minute. They send you an email that says, and I think the real truth of this email is, yeah, we've seen this air conditioning problem before. These cars, when they get to be 5 or 6 years old, something just basically goes bad. And this is going to cost you, because there's no warranty, like $700 or $800 to get it fixed. Like, they actually give you that estimate. They haven't even looked at the car. They've not even looked at the car. They're telling you in advance, based on the data they've collected and whatever you've sent them, that, yeah, we know this is what happens, whatever it is that happens. And we have to replace these 5 things, and it's going to cost you this much money. And I looked at that and I said to myself, look how far we've come. Like, you don't even need to have a licensed mechanic look at a car. The computer is basically looking at data that is being collected in real time and is providing, because of course, under law, they have to give you an estimate that you have to approve before the work is done. That's part of the legal environment that tries to avoid God, I had no idea it was going to cost so much, right? You have to do this all in advance. But usually the mechanic looks at the car. In the case of Tesla, they all do it in a robotic way. There's no human being, to the best of my knowledge, looking at the actual car. They're all just looking at the data. It's like computers looking at data and talking to other computers.
I think that the key here, as we start talking about ethics, is really to grab onto our listeners' interest and say, to motivate people, why should they care about the ethics involved or the lack of ethics involved? Because sometimes with a group of listeners, 85% of whom are proud of how they cheated golf, what's the importance of the ethics? And I think that the long-term nature that oftentimes the unethical behavior may give somebody a short-term advantage, but at very large long-term costs. And that, so our conversation about Tesla is quite relevant in terms of the timing of the feedback loop in terms of maintaining ethical controls.
Right. You could argue the one interesting thing that the internet has done is it's created much more public disclosure of ethical violations. So years ago, decades ago, that E&Y $100 million fine might hit a newspaper on page 9, but it really wouldn't hit kind of all this electronic media that now exists that flashes up on a screen. And so in many ways, you would think that because of the transparency or arguable notoriety that Twitter and Facebook and Google and social media has generated, E&Y would be much more sensitive, because I guess what they didn't do is tell the truth about what they had discovered about these 49 people years ago, and just said, yeah, here's what the facts are. We're turning over all the records. We didn't sanction this. These are people that were acting in a rogue way, and we fire them all if they did that. But they hid it. Like, they basically covered it up. And the cover up is probably what's really costing them the $100 million, not the original ethical breach that was done by the 49 employees. Of course,
right.
49 employees must be like 49 out of 49,000 or more E&Y employees. If you ask the question of how many people work in E&Y, must be a huge number, right?
So it's really not a statistical process. So, for example, it could be that 2% of taxpayers get audited. But, and incidentally, my own tax returns that I've prepared for the last 17 years, it's been well under 1% of my tax returns that have gotten audited. But
that's a good number. That's a good number, right? By the way, E&Y has nearly 300,000 employees, according to the internet. 300,000.
Yes. But what really matters is, are you in the middle of a divorce? And does your ex-spouse, your ex-vendor, your ex-partner, your ex-employee, and are they motivated to turn you in? And so it's not a statistical process. So you can't just say, well, 98% chance that I'm not going to be caught. No, if you're going through a divorce and you've been cheating on your taxes, and your ex-spouse, your ex-girlfriend, your ex-whatever, your ex-employee, they know that you've been cheating on your taxes. Guess what? You need representation now.
Right. It's an interesting thing just to look at some of this data, which is, it looks like what it's saying is that there's been growth over time. So in 2009, there were under 150,000 E&Y worldwide employees, but then we're above 250 as of 2021. And generally, it looks like America's has been sort of growing, but less so than what the growth has been like in EMEIA. What is that? Europe and Middle East? EMEIA. I'm guessing that's what that code means there, right?
I'm not sure myself. Probably.
Yeah, I didn't know that E&Y was headquartered in London. I thought they were headquartered in New York.
The history of the Big Four is spectacular and colorful, and originates with the Italian lenders who finance church positions.
Oh, interesting.
And the Medici businesses. And then debit and credit accounting was developed in UK to account for the railroad industrialization, when suddenly the stock section of the ledger became complex, and you needed to track not just where the money was, but where it came from. And so the credit side and debit credit accounting was introduced at that time with the railroad industrialization in Great Britain. And that's why many of the Big Four have deep ties in the UK.
Interesting. So they're saying $40 billion of revenue from basically 300,000 employees. Of course, they have contractors as well, right?
Let me add that the Medicis were very much a cartel, and that the Big Four today remain a cartel in terms of their economic model. There's not exactly an open market for bidding on, for instance, my firm, my tiny San Francisco-based firm could not effectively obtain a public company audit client. And just because we lack the international resources of having offices in those regions that you just described in your slide.
Yeah, I'm just trying to do the numbers. I mean, to me, it looks like, sort of from the big picture point of view, each employee is, if you say there's 40 billion, right? Billion with a B. So if you say there's 40 billion in revenue over 300,000 employees, I'm leaving the contractors out and I'm taking the 5 zeros out. So I'm looking at those numbers and saying 400,000. So it's basically like 100,000 in revenue, or that doesn't sound right. 130,000 per employee is what's being generated from a revenue point of view. Does that sound right?
I think it's off by a digit. I
think it's more like $1 million
I think so.
per employee.
That would be
to get to 40 billion. $1 million per employee, and 300,000 employees generate $1 million. We should do the math on this, because obviously you need people to generate revenue because it's a service business. Unless you say,
I think net versus gross is also so is your revenue number a net number or a gross number?
Look like a gross number. It says they employ 312,000 employees worldwide. Put that back on the screen just so you can read it. And you could tell me if I'm reading it incorrectly. But we're talking about the pressure that exists, right? Because that's kind of the point that we're making here. And this is true not only for big CPAs, but so in 2021 fiscal year, Ernst & Young employed a total of 312,250 worldwide, headquartered in London. They generated a total of 40 billion US in revenue. 40 billion, right? With 300,000, just to round the numbers, 300,000 people. So if it was 30 billion for 300,000 people, what would we say? Is it 100,000 per person? Can you do that math for me? The combined revenue of the big four was 157 billion in 2020. 157, and E&Y has 40. So I'm doing the numbers, and maybe there's something wrong with these numbers, but I'm doing 40,000.
Yeah, I get the same answer you do, and it does not make sense to me.
Right? It seems too low, right? Because if you take 200,000 and you take the 5 zeros out, you end up with 1, 2, 3. You end up with like a bit more than 100, and let's call it 130,000 per person. That seems too low because these professionals typically make more money, right?
I'm suspecting that the 40 billion US dollars was a net number, not a gross number.
Really? Wow. So you would say the gross number would be like 2 or 3 times that number? A smaller accounting firm like mine is expected to do somewhere around $250,000 per head. And that's not just per employee, but per contractor. Okay. Because that's the other thing that's missing. Like, how many other people are working directly or indirectly? Because I think most accountants are probably billed on an hourly basis like lawyers, right? Generally speaking.
It depends, but back to that, you'd expect a big four would have higher margins and higher results than a tiny firm like mine.
Right.
So, partner salaries at big four are in the neighborhood of, $1 million and above.
Right. Yeah, and they had a big payout too, because aren't they going public, or there's some story about their
consulting firm spinning off
and resulting in the partners receiving kind of a big bonus as a result of the spinoff.
Yeah.
So E&Y is in the news in a variety of ways. And are they getting too big? Is the big CPA group of four just getting too big, just like big law is getting too big, to the derogation of the profession as a whole? Because it's got to be embarrassing to see that you've been tagged for $100 million. That's not a good piece of news. Now, maybe for most of the public, it's no big deal. But for 49 people who went awry, probably more than that, it's like $1 million plus, maybe $2 million per person. It's not chump change by any stretch, right?
I'm not sure that spanking the firms is necessarily an answer that fixes things. I think overhauling the ethical focus throughout the system, including the schools that train the people and the administration of the professional tests and the boards that set the professional standards in each state, I think that tightening the screws everywhere would get my support.
Right, but that doesn't seem to be happening. It seems like there's a blunt instrument here. It's called a fine. The fine could be viewed as a tax. The tax could be viewed as a cost of doing business. The cost of doing business can be viewed as just pass it on to the client, because the client needs the support from people who can't pass these exams without cramming, and they don't have the time to cram. So they pass around answer keys. I mean, it's like a amazing circular set of activities that are all bad from the profession's point of view, but from maybe the business point of view, it's like a footnote to the story. It's not anything that really people just shrug their shoulders and say, okay, we got tagged for 100 million, so KMPG got tagged for 50. So what's the big deal? You know, we're all
indirect costs to society and that need to be factored into this thing. Can society afford to have the auditors who police the retirement system and the healthcare system and the governmental spending and the GAO? Can all these auditors be corrupt, come from a corrupt training and corrupt environment?
Yeah, I mean, I have to tell you, I was watching some of today's January 6th hearings because they scheduled this on a moment's notice. And of course, they had a bombshell witness talk about how Trump absolutely knew that what he was doing was fomenting a riot at the Capitol. And the evidence was pretty nasty against Trump. And I thought to myself, think about what the signaling is at the top about the lack of ethics of the president of the United States in the way he was trying to arm wrestle continuing in power as against every advisor, including his own, Attorney General, Bill Barr, and his own daughter, saying, look, you lost the election, it's game over, just move on. And he had none of it. He was going to figure out a way to get Pence to presumably stop the count or change the count or throw it back to the states. And it really is an eyesore for the nation because it makes us look so corrupt. And it's the same subject, really. It's a lack of ethics at the top, where you would say to yourself, this should certainly disqualify him from being able to run for president. But there's no constitutional provision that says he can't run because he engaged in corrupt activities unless he was impeached, which of course he wasn't. They came close, but they didn't actually impeach him. So to me, it's a weird thing, right? It's a weird thing.
Is having a lot of challenges and nobody's doing anything about it. There's been several close elections, not just the last one, but the last half dozen elections. There have been a bunch of close ones, and nobody has looked at setting national standards to tighten the election rule. Let's jump for a moment to the Supreme Court and the recent cases concerning abortion where
doesn't make us look great either.
I'm
right?
not going to take a position on abortion. It's irrelevant to this conversation. These people went through their candidacy interviews and said that they considered Roe versus Wade settled law, just like the tax code, which has only been around for 100 years, but is still considered settled law. And now there's a 6-3 decision that, no, it's not settled law. We're going to change it.
Right.
How do you feel about that as an attorney?
It's the opposite of the way I was trained, of course, more than 40 years ago, going on like 50 years ago. The doctrine, the Latin term is stare decisis, which is respect for the decisions which have been entered, making interpretations that have been made as kind of the settled law. And then, of course, going to Senate approval and saying that you have a high degree of respect for the doctrine of stare decisis and Roe versus Wade is settled law. And then really not adhering to what might be called the representation that was made to Susan Collins and I guess to a few other senators who made the vote that they made. I mean, I have to believe that people will look back on this period and say there was so many aberrant behaviors, whether you call it January 6th, you call it the blockage of Merrick Garland as a justice when Obama was still in office and had the right to appoint a justice, and Mitch McConnell blocked the Senate approval, even though that should have happened in the ordinary course. And now Merrick Garland's the U.S. attorney the attorney general who has to decide whether to prosecute Trump. I mean, it's such a small world kind of thing. But if you think about the big picture, it does kind of get to the question of ethics, which is, were Gorsuch and Kavanaugh honest? I think the view is that Amy Coney Barrett said, Roe versus Wade is what it is, and I don't know if it's really solid precedent or not. I'm not convinced. Like, I think she was more of a square shooter on that. I think Kavanaugh and Gorsuch played their cards differently. And so Susan Collins is pretty upset, according to the news report. Senator Collins from Maine felt like she was misled. A couple of other senators have said the same thing. I don't think they can impeach a sitting justice over what happened in those discussions, private or public. I think the reality is that when a case comes in front of you as a justice, you get to make a decision that you think is the right decision. And ultimately, that majority, I guess it's 6-3, but I think the Chief Justice was leaning more towards a middle ground position rather than, it's more like 5-1-3 than it is 6-3. I read the whole 200 pages. I thought to myself, gosh, I would have never guessed that in 50 years we would be back to the way things were like in the 1960s or 70s. But we have a very conservative court right now, and we're going to see probably a number of things change in the next 10 or 20 years. And it is a result of essentially an election that probably was to some degree itself tainted by the lack of ethics of what occurred through social media vis-a-vis the Russians and the way in which data was misused to promote ideology in social media that wasn't really correct. So we're living in a crazy period of time, Steve, and I don't really know how to summarize it except to say that we're going to look back on this period of time, or our kids or grandkids are, and they're going to say, wow, did that really happen? And the answer is, yeah, it did really happen. And it had some major ramifications, probably for many future generations. That's for sure. So yeah, I'm pretty concerned that the ethics of the nation as a whole, in the highest levels of institution, the President of the United States, the Office of the Presidency, the Supreme Court of the United States, the Senate of the United States, the Congress of the United States, the House of Representatives, all of it is under a cloud of ethical doubt, as are some major professions, including both big law and big accounting. And I think it's an unfortunate situation that we're in right now. I don't know how it gets corrected. Hopefully someone will figure out the right approach, but there's no obvious point and click solution in my mind. And I'm not sure just doing more training about ethics is going to change it, particularly when people are cheating on the ethics exam to pass the actual exam itself, which is kind of funny, but sad in a bigger picture kind of way. So I don't know what the answer is, but
does this affect your practice in that you have appeared before the Supreme Court?
Well, I would say that there's more sensitivity in general in the practice of law, that lawyers are pushing ethical boundaries all the time in ways that are sad, particularly if you represent smaller clients against bigger companies or bigger law firms. Smaller clients can't really afford to deal with what I would call the aggressive nature of what can be unleashed on them. But in general, I would say that the U.S. Supreme Court has taken a credibility hit that Justice Roberts must have many sleepless nights about, because it happened under his watch. And he couldn't apparently get agreement to a middle ground under his watch. So I would not be surprised if he decides, particularly if a Republican takes office in 2024, to resign early and let, sort of move on kind of the way Justice Kennedy did, because I think it's too stressful. I think as human beings, we can only take a certain amount of stress. And I got to believe that the job has gotten extremely stressful for him. And he's lost really the hegemony of leading the court, because he couldn't get, presumably the vote would have been either Kavanaugh or Gorsuch to move towards his middle ground. That would have been probably an easier outcome to accept, which is his middle ground, which was essentially to clarify or modify Roe versus Wade, but he couldn't get the votes. So he obviously has lost a certain degree of power to 5 justices who pretty much have a very textual conservative agenda, which is not really the way the historical Constitution has been interpreted. It just isn't. I mean, the easiest example of that to give is the Eighth Amendment rule against cruel and unusual punishment. It's a very generic statement, but in modern times, it's very different than the way cruel and unusual was viewed back in the 1700s. I mean, we don't do various things that were viewed as punishments that were allowed under the Eighth Amendment because of a modernized view of what's cruel and unusual. So that's an example of modern interpretation of the Constitution. Not looking back to, well, if this is the way they did it in 1700, thumb screws and, drawn and quartering people and hanging them and a bunch of other stuff, right?
And no income tax.
Yeah, right. That was another good one. I heard someone make an argument today that it's cruel and unusual punishment for a woman for women generically to have to bear a child that they don't want before viability of the child. Like, you could argue that you could recast this whole abortion question around a woman's right to choose is a woman's right to preserve her right against cruel and unusual punishment, as well as her right against involuntary servitude under the 8th and 13th Amendments, respectively. And that, of course, never has gotten any play, and no one's even tried to argue that in the Supreme Court. But there is at least a potential argument out there that one could make that says when you deny a woman choice, you are imposing on her some degree of punishment for something she doesn't want, and maybe even involuntarily received, particularly if it's a result of a crime or a rape or an abuse or something else. So we're getting a little off topic from accounting and law, but generally speaking, I would say this ethics issue is something we should revisit, because sadly, I think we're going to continue to see these sorts of news items with no one really even yawning about it. Everyone's just going to say, yeah, that's what happens in a world that's moving as fast as this world is moving. People are doing what they have to do to get to the next step. And the fact that it violates an ethical principle doesn't seem to really be that important in the big scheme of things.
My son has just emerged from his cave of Nintendo and Legos, and he's lurking right off the screen. Say hello.
Hello. Hello. Are you there?
He's too shy to say hello.
Okay, well, we'll have him on a different episode so he can tell us what it's like to be in the metaverse, right?
My question for you from him indirectly, I think it would be his question, is in light of all this recent stuff, would you encourage him to become an engineer as he's thinking, become an accountant, or become an attorney as I'm suggesting?
I think I would go with Dad's view with one modification, which is become a data-driven lawyer who knows how to use software tools to leverage available evidence and data, because the future lawyer is going to be more of an information scientist than just a zealous advocate. So think about it like we have a bridge, that's the bridge that's in the background, and two bodies, the legal area plus the technology area, are merging so that individuals that can bridge both and can use data-driven approaches for solving legal problems with software competencies, that's the future lawyer that I see in the 22nd century, or maybe the end of the 21st century. So that's where I would say if he could get a dousing of software expertise with the dousing of legal expertise, I think he'll be a very valuable individual, and can have him send his resume to me. I'd be happy to interview him when he gets to that point, in life. How old is he now, Steve?
He's almost 12.
Okay, so that's a good time to start feeding him, and I'll send you some of the Kindle books that are being written about this whole area of legal tech and law tech and how it plays into fintech and insure tech and all these areas that are rapidly becoming data-driven with software and AI-based automation. So for sure, that's something you should give him access to the Kindle and get him a Kindle and start loading it up with those subjects, because
I'd be very interested in that myself, and I think there might be another podcast in our future that.
Yeah, let's do it, Steve. I have to bid you good night because I'm a little ahead of you in time. But thanks for spending your time. Give my regards to everyone. I'll look forward to doing it again with you. Thanks. Talk to you later.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.